We can begin. I'd like to first begin by introducing myself. My name is Miskogijik McGregor. I'm from Kitigan Zibi and Amjanong First Nations. I'm currently the manager of Indigenous Financial Literacy at CPA Canada, and I will be moderating your session today, so welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the territory that I'm on right now. I'm currently located in Ottawa, Ontario, which is traditional unceded lands of the Anishinaabe, Omamiwinini peoples. And as a member of that nation, I'd like to welcome those who are located in Ottawa today to the territory, and those who are across Turtle Island, across Canada. I encourage you to look into the territories that you sit on and to really understand the first peoples of these lands and really form that relationship with place. So welcome to our session. This session is Financial Wellness and Healing. Can building financial wellness help Indigenous communities? Indigenous peoples in Canada still bear the wounds of colonization and its lingering legacies that continue to negatively impact our communities. Many Indigenous peoples are not from affluent backgrounds. Many don't have savings, and they have no cushion to land on in a moment of crisis. The pandemic was yet another setback for many of our peoples across Turtle Island, and the current rise in inflation is just going to further exacerbate these inequities. So today you will hear from our speakers on what they observed in their communities during the pandemic. They will also talk about the work that they do in Indigenous communities to help our people build their financial wellness. So before we begin, I'd like to begin with an anchor exercise, and we're just going to take 1 or 2 minutes. And the question I'm asking is, based on your work, how would you define financial wellness? So please take a minute to reflect and share your thought in the chat. So while you're doing that, I'd like to introduce Simon Brockpe. So Simon Brockpe is a MA and CAPA. He's Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. He's Bear Clan and is a member of Kitigan Zibi Anishinaabe First Nations, which is located near Maniwaki, Quebec. He is currently Senior Vice President, Education, Communications, and Services with the First Nations Education Administrators Association, which began operations in 2019. Simon is co-chair of the Financial Literacy Working Group for Indigenous Peoples with the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. His full bio can be found on the Able Prosper website. But before I welcome him, I'd like to say, while Simon is speaking, please type your questions in the Q&A section and I will monitor them. You can also review other participants' questions and vote for the ones you'd like me to ask when the Q&A starts. So the more votes a question gets, the more likely it is I will ask it during our panel discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Simon Brockpe to our discussion today. Simon?
Good afternoon. Good to see you. I think the last time I saw you was a couple of years ago at my sister's.
Yeah.
We're in Ottawa. Yeah, so I'm glad you're working. So appreciate seeing you today and welcome everybody. I'm going to have a slideshow. So we're going to go through the slideshow and I can answer questions as we go forward. Okay, here we go. So I'm not sure if that's mine, but no, it's Andrew Heiss. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk about.
I'm so sorry, I pulled the wrong one. I'm gonna pull the right one right away. Sorry about that, Simon.
Okay, no problem. So we're going to talk about Indigenous or First Nations financial wellness. I think in the community when we talk about financial literacy, I talked to my mother about it. It was 95 and she goes, oh yeah, that's budgeting. And some of the materials that I've been able to develop over the few years, she's actually said, oh, give me a copy of that one. I did one with Prosper Canada on managing your money, and it has stories in it. And in the stories, I think it's important that Indigenous people view financial literacy and financial wellness from their stories and from their perspective. So in this one guide, we talk about the chickadee. There's lots of chickadees here in Ottawa, but the chickadee, like humans, save seeds in the fall. So here in Ottawa, you'll see chickadees flying around. Apparently, they hide away 60,000 seeds, and in fact, even their brain grows to remember where all these seeds are. But when we're dealing with Indigenous people, we have to have culturally appropriate approaches and stories. And I think stories is a wonderful way to communicate ideas, and particularly in a Indigenous community. So we're going to be talking about recover and rebuilding Canadian financial security during the pandemic. So next slide. So the one of the things that we talk about when we talk about income and wellness, we use the social determinants of health. And the social determinants of health, are holistic, but it's also incorporates education, employment, institutions in the community. So we have to think about the bigger picture. Next slide. So here we use I'm using the Canadian Well-Being Index. And you can see the difference between Canadians, which is on the top line, and Indigenous people on the lower and the orange line. So there's a big gap in well-being, and that has to do with income, employment, education, housing, and so there is a big difference. And with reconciliation, Canada really has to do a lot of work in catching up, providing the resources and the supports for Indigenous people. Next slide. So this just covers the, how they make up the well-being index through education, labor force, income, and housing. And just one point while we're going to the next slide, a lot of First Nations housing and Inuit housing is really live in crowded conditions, which are become unhealthy. So we're going to look at stress, the impact of colonization, loss of culture, poverty, low education attainment, and poor health. So next slide. So one of the things that we don't often talk about this is a slide on that compares non-Aboriginal to Aboriginal in terms of major depressive episodes. And if you're low income, which is on the left, there's a bigger disparity between Canadians and Indigenous people. But as people's income increases to higher income, there's still a gap. But what we're interested in today is that lower income gap. Next slide. So part of the theme of this conference is the impact that mental health has had on Indigenous people as a result of COVID. So in this study, 6 in 10 Indigenous participants reported that their mental health has worsened since the onset of physical distancing. And just to remind you that, that's the, where we stand 2 meters apart from each other. So just a simple change in the situation of having to physically distance has caused problems in First Nations communities, Inuit and Métis. Next slide. So the other, and this is not a surprise to any of us, that Indigenous women report high stress and anxiety compared to Canadians, and it's part of the impact of COVID-19 on mental health with Indigenous women. Next slide. And then data reflect mental health disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, which you see from this slide. So there's a lot of research being done now, and a lot of it is saying that prior to COVID, there were these disparities, but with COVID, there's even an increase in disparities in mental health. Next slide. So we're going to be talking, next slide. We're going to be talking about the impact of poverty and financial stress on individuals in general. So there was a study done in the U.S. where they looked at financial stress, and which results in poor mental health, and even resulting in impaired decision making. So one of the studies that was done was they took middle income people and put them on a homeless diet, which was kind of a starvation diet, and they tested them while they were on the regular diet, and they found that people were able to perform at a normal level doing these various tests. But when they were on the homeless diet, their ability went down 35%. So you could just imagine people's impairment in terms of decision making and the results in the community. Next slide. So there was a study done in New Zealand with Maori, and they were looking at a particular community where they had land claims. And what the community did was they looked further down the line, generations ahead, and they were looking at funds to go to university, funds for housing, funds for retirement. And so they put money into a child's bank when they were born, put in some money, and subsequent years they would add to it. And if parents put in, say, $100, the community would put in $400. And what they found over a period of years is that the level of financial literacy was the same for this Maori community as to other New Zealanders. So having programs and approaches that engage youth at a very early age with making decisions about their own money. And we know from other research that when you put money away for university or college, that a child has a 35% greater chance of going to post-secondary institutions. This was a study done in, next slide, you had the right slide. The next slide, this was a study done in the United States, and they were comparing casino money that was being given to community members. So in some cases, communities were investing in things like education, economic development, and in some communities they didn't. So that even with additional income, communities that did not invest had poor financial outcomes. They were spending too much money, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. Next slide. So what I wanted to say, and I'll just, you could take the slides off. What I wanted to say was that some of the activities and programs that are going on across Canada are important to financial wellness. For example, the volunteer tax clinics have had a good impact on First Nations communities in terms of money going into homes that had not previously received this funding. 4 or 5 years ago, the federal government was saying that 50% of First Nations were not accessing the child tax benefit. And through the work of AFO Canada, CPA Canada, and other organizations, they're working to increase the number of families that are tax filing. So I think my time is up. I'm looking forward to the other speakers' presentations. Miigwech.
Totally miigwech for sharing, Simon. That was great. I'd like to next introduce Helen Bobbywash. So Helen Bobbywash is an FCPA, FCMA, and CAFM. Helen is an independent accountant who is Anishinaabe. She's a proud mother to Michigan, her 17-year-old son. She's traveled across Ontario working with First Nations and Aboriginal organizations for approximately 25 years. Ms. Bobbywash operates her independent accounting firm on the Atikameksheng Anishinaabe near Sudbury, Ontario. Helen's services focus on bridging financial capacity within Aboriginal communities. So I'm very pleased to welcome Helen Bobbywash.
Miigwech Misko. I am joining you from Swakamuck, known as Sudbury, Ontario, in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area, and the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabe and the Wanapitei First Nation. So I just wanted to share some these 3 items with you this afternoon, based on my experience and some of the knowledge that I've shared with specific groups of Indigenous people. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the legacy of colonization. If we look at the definition of colonization, it's all about domination, establishing control over Indigenous people, and exploiting the lands that are settled. Colonization is not unique to North America. It is a worldwide issue, but I can only speak about what I've experienced and learned in Canada. And when Canada was formed as a nation, the colonial government saw us as uncivilized and inhuman. Governments established racist legislation and policy throughout history that led society to consider Indigenous people as less than. The Indian Act was set up to get rid of us. And when that didn't happen, systems were set up to oppress Indigenous people. This included our system of government. So Indigenous people carry a lot of stress resulting from colonization. We've had 3 to 4 generations now who've lived through this, and we carry the stress from it. And this is what I call the legacy of colonization, and the legacy really is evident. Simon mentioned some of the disparities in mental health, but it's really evident, and the stress is coming out in a number of forms, such as chronic, sometimes multiple illnesses, higher rates of mental health issues, higher rates of addictions, incarceration, and violence against our people, including thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But we've proven that we're strong and we can bear a lot. But we only have a limited capacity because we've been living with this stress for so long. So when it comes to setbacks, we don't have the capacity to deal with much more. Misko already mentioned the financial setbacks, and that we haven't had the opportunity to set aside savings to cushion any blow that we have that's financial related. And when it's a spiritual or mental impact, we don't have many deposits in the Bank of Mojo. And this really stems from legislation and policy aimed at extinguishing us. Now we need to talk about the pandemic. And let's be realistic. Everybody has experienced significant stress because of the pandemic and the changes that it brought. This includes Indigenous people. But my concern for Indigenous people is that we were already carrying intergenerational stress, and the pandemic added to that burden. And as with everybody else, there were few outlets to relieve the stress due to the physical distancing requirements and fear of bringing infectious diseases to medically vulnerable family members. Add to this the media coverage of the grave sites that were confirmed at Indian residential schools across Canada. And I have to say that the sites weren't discovered because the Indigenous communities knew that they were there, but it took scientific instruments to confirm that without disrupting the grave sites. And this media coverage re-traumatized families who had already been living with the legacy of colonization in Indian residential schools. And because of the pandemic, they were unable to gather and help each other to recover from it. I do want to say, though, that Indigenous people didn't just experience negative impacts resulting from the pandemic. Many communities turned to what was important during the pandemic. That included our children and elders. And they took measures with pride to support and protect their people. The Indigenous communities turned to traditional practices and increased land-based learning for their students. And this particular photo is actually from a nursing home in Weequampong, Ontario. And they posted photos of their residents on social media to remind family community members about the importance of protecting their elders, who are the people in the community who keep their history and their knowledge. And communities across Canada took positive steps toward ensuring that their people were safe. And I really feel that our strength that enabled us to survive extinguishment legislation and policies, and our love for our people and culture will help us get through the pandemic and beyond. The media coverage of the residential school graves, though, has really shown the truth to the world, and more truth is coming out about how Indigenous people are treated and are treated now and have been treated in the past. And it really gives me hope that we can move toward reconciliation. Now, I want to switch gears and start sharing some information about two initiatives that I was involved in. And the first one was with the 60 Scoop class action settlement. So in 2009, class action litigation was launched to seek compensation on behalf of Indigenous people who were taken from their families and placed within non-Indigenous families. In 2017, the Superior Court of Canada found that Canada had breached its common law duty of care for Indigenous children in care. And the courts approved a class action settlement agreement in early 2018, which provided $750 million in compensation for class members. Collectiva was appointed the administrator, and it organized sessions across Canada to share information about the settlement and how to apply for compensation. They partnered with AFOA Canada to deliver financial literacy training within the information sessions. The sessions were held across Canada in 2018-2019 by Indigenous liaison officers, and I took on the role of an Indigenous liaison officer in Ontario. I facilitated the information sessions about the 60 Scoop settlement, as well as delivered the financial literacy training that AFOA Canada developed. And AFOA Canada developed a workbook called It's My Life. We used it in the information sessions as a tool for people to dream about what could they do with the settlement and think about how to develop a holistic plan for the use of the money under the settlement. We didn't tell them at any point how to use their money. We just gave them a framework for how to plan the use of it. The sessions were attended by people who felt they were part of the 60 Scoop. And I have to say, it really changed my life. I was taken from my home and placed with non-Indigenous foster parents when I was 4. And I was honored to hear people's stories about their lives and their experience with non-Indigenous families, and even how they dreamed about the use of their settlement. And I found it was a place where people discovered that they weren't alone. Now, because of my experience delivering these sessions, I strongly believe that anytime a group of people who are expected to come into a lump sum of money should be provided with information on how to plan the use of their money. Participants were really positive about the information sessions and how the information was shared with them. And I recommend that anytime there's a class action, when the judgment is made for that settlement, that it involves provisions for financial training or information sharing. And the reason is just from what I saw during the sessions, but also the Aboriginal Healing Foundation did some research on the impact of compensation under the Indian Residential School Settlement, which is another class action that has been settled. That research found that survivors reported negative impacts from the payments, such as feelings of guilt and shame, exploitation by community members and predatory salespeople, and elder abuse. And I really feel that information sessions like the ones we did for the 60 settlement really can help people to be prepared and be aware of the potential negative impacts from that compensation. So AFWay Canada was responsible for the financial literacy side of the information sessions. So I encourage you, if you have any questions or want information about those booklets, to reach out to Sharon Slippery, who you're going to be hearing next, and she can give you some more information on it. And lastly, I just wanted to briefly share with you about a more recent experience that I've had developing and delivering financial capability workbooks and a workshop for Indigenous women. And I was hired by NACA, which is the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, in 2019 and 2020 to do some research on Indigenous women entrepreneurs. And it involved a literature review as well as a survey of Indigenous women entrepreneurs across Canada, where we asked them, what could you use to help you succeed in business? What we found was that Indigenous women are very thoughtful and they make calculated decisions about their business because they have family and community responsibilities and they don't want to risk that as they're getting into business. So they seek out support and services to help them develop their business. And one key area that they identified where they need support is financial training to help them succeed in their business. So then it was decided to develop some financial capability workbooks for Indigenous women. 3 workbooks were developed, but it was decided that rather than focus on financial capability for business, just take a step back and focus on personal financial capability. Because once the women saw that they already are using financial capability skills for themselves personally, maybe they might want to brush up or sharpen up their skills in one or 2 areas, but that could be applied to a business should they eventually decide to pursue a dream for a business. And the workbooks were developed in partnership with the Native Women's Association of Canada. This year, CPA Canada partnered with NACA to support the maintenance and development of further resources. But the financial capability workbooks, since they were already in existence, was a good fit to launch the partnership between NACA and CPA Canada. So CPA Canada conducted a technical review of the workbooks to ensure they met the CPA Canada standards. They did because the CPA wrote them. And then they started working on the development of workshop material. I wrote the material because I also had written the workbook material. So with CPA Canada and NACA, we developed workshop materials. And then we piloted it just last month in Atlantic Canada with the Alnwick Development Group, which is an Aboriginal financial institution in Atlantic Canada. And this photo is the group of women who participated in the workshop, both as participants or resource people. And I'm really proud of the work that we did on the workbooks in the workshop because financial literacy research pertaining to Indigenous people, which Simon actually was involved in, has confirmed that successful Indigenous financial literacy initiatives are community-driven and delivered, culturally relevant and safe. They provide practical benefits. They use partnerships in delivering the program, and they use a strengths-based approach. And we made sure that all of those points were addressed in the workbooks and the workshop material. It was a wonderful experience to be a part of the initiative and to be a part of the pilot workshop. And I was really proud to be in a room of all these amazing women and to see them sharing their own personal stories and really being supportive of each other. So next up is that really the materials are being translated right now. They're expected to be published early in 2022. And NACA, in association with their network of Aboriginal financial institutions, expect to launch the workshops in the spring, and it will be supported by CPA Canada's financial literacy volunteers. They'll be available to all of the AFIs as required to support the delivery of the material. And if you would like more information on that, you can contact Magnolia Perron at NACA. She is their Indigenous Women and Youth Program Coordinator. And I just want to say miigwech to Prosper Canada for inviting me to share some of my experience and my knowledge in this area. And I also want to thank you for being an ally to Indigenous people in Canada.
Jimmy Gwetch, Helen, that was very insightful, and I just wanted to say a note on that. I was fortunate enough to be able to be in attendance at that session, at our pilot session for those workshops, and the energy in that room was incredible. It was so powerful to see, the work that Helen had done in partnership with NACA being so impactful in communities. So Jimmy Gwetch again, Helen, and we're looking forward to seeing where these workshops go. I'd like to next introduce Sharon Slippery. So Sharon is the administrator for AFOA Canada's Indigenous Financial Wellness Programs. She is a lifelong public servant of Cree and Saulteaux descent and a project manager with over 20 years of experience working with and for Indigenous peoples in various roles and initiatives at the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, the Assembly of First Nations, and the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association of Canada. So I'm very pleased to welcome Sharon Slippery. Sharon?
I think I might. Can you hear me? I think you can.
I can hear you well.
Okay, fantastic. Dancy, Sharon Slippery is my English name. Zogabu Kwenindikaz. I'm, as mentioned, I'm Cree and Saulteaux descent from the prairies. I moved to Ottawa 30 years ago with the goal of working at the Assembly of First Nations within the first 5 years and get some government experience and go home. But I loved working at the national level and I enjoyed working with our people. So I stayed. And one day, hopefully soon, I will hop a tumbleweed going west and get dropped off somewhere in central Saskatchewan. I would like to acknowledge that I'm on traditional unceded Algonquin territory, and I can't do it as eloquently as Misko did. And I am currently residing in Misko and Simon's traditional lands. Thank you for having me. As is evident within our participation in this event, the pandemic has created challenges for many of our organizations, encouraging us to pivot to online delivery service. AFOA Canada was already delivering online services, such as the Certified Aboriginal Professional Administrator and Certified Aboriginal Financial Managers accreditation programs. The pandemic allowed us to further expand our online services from virtual capacity workshops to virtual tax clinic training sessions. As you know, many Indigenous families and low-income households during tax season, we deliver tax training sessions as well, and a tax clinic. Tax time is an important opportunity to access benefits. AFOA Canada and members support the Indigenous community by delivering our virtual tax clinic through Canada Revenue, through the CRA online platform, and our services are entirely delivered by phone and virtually. We did this last year and we're incorporating it again this year, understanding that there are challenges remaining with the pandemic. We also provide training to host community volunteer income tax clinics, as I mentioned earlier. We have online resources. This is sort of where we pivoted as well. We used to deliver a lot of these things in person, like the training clinic, volunteer income tax clinic sessions. With super clinics, we work in conjunction with CRA. However, we're not able to travel into the communities. We as staff can travel, but I don't think we can get into some communities. So we've had to do a lot of online delivery, and we've transferred a lot of our material such as the dollars and cents financial wellness training for Indigenous youth, elementary, middle, and secondary school modules to online services. So groups of children or individual themselves can access our training resources and see their story from their perspective. It's primarily First Nation. We did our best to try and incorporate all Indigenous groups. That can be challenging because there are so many. We also provide financial wellness training for lump sum settlement payments, and Helen kind of touched on that one. A lot of our work has been developed. I mean, the work that I'm doing right now was built on both Simon and Helen's work, which I'm very thankful for. So financial wellness training for lump sum, it deals with, provides training for an understanding financial literacy for residential school settlements, land claim settlements where financial resources are shared. The 60 Scoop, there's also currently the Day Scholars Initiative, which that is residential school attendees who went home. There's a difference between the residential school survivors who stayed there overnight and those that went home. Some, and I'll use Kamloops as an example, some of them had to be shuttled in from Kamloops because they weren't allowed to go to the local town school. They had to attend the residential school on the reserve. So these are the day scholars that have been provided or given or earned or sued, whatever it is, a settlement. So this is part of that initiative. And sudden wealth syndrome. Again, that comes from land claims. We also provide retirement training planning resources for all our audience, like whether that's for the practitioner or for the individual who wants to learn or test themselves on their own retirement planning process. And new to us this year is our podcast, Money Smarts. We have series 1 that talks income tax filing. That was released in April, May of last year, and is period specific to income tax season 2020 for Indigenous peoples. We discuss the challenges of income tax filing and also the COVID relief benefits with various CRA representatives. Thank you, CRA. The second series, which we're releasing during Financial Literacy Month, we talk financial self-care. Now, we talk mental, and I'm speaking to the converted here, but we talk mental health self-care, we talk about physical self-care. I mean, I got up and I did a couple jumping jacks this morning. I had a coffee that helped me mentally, but we don't talk about financial self-care, the simple basics, and converting that and trying to help our community members understand that. I'm going to relate a story. My Uncle Tom, when I went home this summer, talked about, he says he's a former residential school survivor. Now, I encourage you to do some research on residential school survivors. There's a thought process for many of them where they had no power when they're kids, and sometimes when they get older, they want to control, and it's with anybody, like when you grow. Anyways, he comes from that, and he's an old school. Oh, I love him dearly, but he's our elder, and I wouldn't dare argue with him. Anyways, he challenged me. He said, why you're not going to get our people to understand financial literacy or financial wellness? And before I could answer him, a family member interrupted. However, I did put some thought in it afterwards. I thought to myself, if I was provided with the opportunity, this is what I would answer to him. We survived traditionally and historically prior to contact. We survived the winters and the summers in times of fast and famine. And how did we, if we didn't have good financial planning skills, how did we adequately sustain ourselves, our community, with spending, saving, sharing, and planning the distribution of from goods from the Walmart of the Plains, also known as the Buffalo? Understanding this, and relating it to Indigenous concepts, we can better understand financial wellness and financial literacy by incorporating several financial practices in partnership with our traditional practices. And this builds on the Managing Money booklet that also Simon had talked about earlier. What else could I say? Well, growing up on the communities, Indigenous communities right now are exploring new resources, new resource revenue sharing processes, investments, developing e-com communities, procurement, international trade cooperation, sustainability, wealth creation, and energy and natural resource development. This was not always the case. New money comes into the community, and it's difficult sometimes for community members to understand how you are not able to access these dollars immediately, that it's a process that you build. It's got to be built on. And financial literacy and financial understanding will help community members understand this entire process that much more. Some do, some don't. And I know I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here. I'm trying to figure out a way up here to how to say that a little bit better. AFOA Canada, and I'm going to go back to AFOA Canada, has, what am I going to say here? Sorry, I got to go back to some spot here. In the simplest form, financial wellness and building on the material and the supports for Indigenous people is using the tools and resources that AFOA Canada has provided in conjunction and built on, again, the work of both Simon and Helen. And of course, who have identified a number of systemic barriers that include negative past experiences through colonization, etc. And I'm going to share something here that talks about how the world has changed. And I'm going to put it in the simplest form that I can. I grew up, I'm going to age myself here. I grew up in the 70s and 80s as a young person. Growing up on the prairies in the 70s and 80s, it never occurred to me that I could become something more than what I was. I'll explain that, because I never saw an Indigenous person working behind the counter or in a service industry in any capacity, a bank. It never even occurred to me that I could become a banker as a child, because my mother wasn't even allowed to open a bank account in the early 70s. So for me to even equate financial security with a job was challenging. I couldn't think about, it didn't even, anyways. So when I moved away, I got some education. I decided to work here. I went home. The magnitude of my growing up just hit me like when I went into McDonald's. I know this sounds silly. I went into McDonald's, and behind the counter was a large burly, and this is in the 90s, a large burly young man, Indigenous man. He had on his little McDonald's hat. His little shirt was slightly askew, and wrinkled. And he looked in with all the enthusiasm of every McDonald's worker across coast to coast to coast worldwide. He says, "Welcome to McDonald's. How can I take your order?" I just stood there. The magnitude of the situation just hit me, and I stared at him, and I'm sure he thought I was some sort of crazy lady. And I couldn't help myself because I'm a hugger. I reached over and I touched his hand. And and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I said, "I don't mean to weird out on you." I said, "But you standing behind that counter and working is amazing to me. I didn't grow up in this kind of environment. I would never have thought that there would be a time, even though, I was working over here and doing all this other stuff, that I would walk into a McDonald's and I would see a young person standing behind there who grew up in the same environment that I might have occupied, or in the same space that I occupied." So for me, that was mind-blowing. So for me, as an educated person, working in this environment with financial wellness, to be completely blown away with this kind of firsthand experience, My goal as the financial wellness administrator at AFOA Canada is to provide an understanding, to provide hope, to provide knowledge and understanding that we as community members are changing and evolving, and we will continue to change, but also to understand where we came from and understand that it was not that long ago where we were able to open bank accounts, to where we were able to access services in rural or remote communities, let alone electronic banking services. I mean, I think about my father-in-law, everything was checked to him. There's no way that he would even think about accessing with his debit card, even though he was given one. So, from a microeconomic perspective, my goal and AFOA's goal are to provide resources that'll help these low and modest income families and Indigenous people in the communities, and inspire young people to pursue a career in finance, because it is actually quite, I'm learning things as we go on all of this. That's part of the reason why it became a passion to me, is I was not raised with any of this knowledge. This is all something new. I've made a number of mistakes throughout my lifetime, and I will continue to make a number of mistakes, but less and to a lesser degree, fingers crossed. Achieve financial wellness and financial growth for themselves and their children, to open a bank account, sustain a solid credit score, have some savings set aside, and acquire financial assets that include benefits, and also provide for future generations by investing in RESPs, investing in your children's future, and knowing that they already knew the value, but building on that. And that's all I have to say. I hope that was enough. Thank you.
Miigwech, and thank you very much, Sharon. That was really inspiring. I really appreciate the story, and just how powerful some of these small things that I think everyday Canadians, non-Indigenous people, would take for granted, such as savings and credit score and opening a bank account. How powerful those things could be for our peoples across Turtle Island. So, miigwech for the work that you do, and miigwech for sharing. I'd like to now pivot into the Q&A portion of our day. Please note that you can submit your questions in the Q&A section of the chat, and that is just a little box to the right. And in there, you can submit your questions. You can vote on which question you would like to have asked, and I will attend to them as they come. So I'm not sure. If anyone has questions that are specific to one of our panelists, please let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to pose it to the whole group, and we can have a little bit of a roundtable discussion. So one of the first questions that I saw, and this kind of goes along with what Simon was speaking about, and the question reads: Indigenous peoples don't need a settler telling them what to do, but I am one of the only people in my city doing financial literacy. And the question is, how can I respectfully interact with Indigenous communities? And a modifier to that would be, what can organizations involved in financial literacy do to help? So on that, I'd like to pose that to Simon.
Great question. We were asked to come up with some questions if you didn't come up with one. And this was exactly the question that I thought you might ask. So, the Canadians who work in this area, I really encourage your organization or institution to engage with Indigenous communities at the local level. We need this all across Canada. In the urban centers, in rural, remote, isolated. But I think particularly in the remote and isolated areas, First Nations and Métis need your support, need your advice, and I would just encourage you to reach out. Sharon.
Sorry, I was just reading the comments. I apologize. It's fantastic.
Great, and maybe I can pose the same question to Helen as well.
Thanks. I would actually like to add to that because, first of all, like Simon said, many remote and northern communities don't have all of the capacity that they are able to deliver that for Indigenous people around financial capability and wellness. I would also suggest, and this is what we've suggested to CPAs with the NACA Indigenous Women Entrepreneurship or Indigenous Women Financial Capability Workshop, is come at it from a perspective of sharing information. Don't come off as the expert, the financial expert, because we all, like within our teachings, we're all at the same level. Like there's a teaching around humility where no one is any better or any less than. So if you can approach it from a perspective of you want to share some information, that goes a long way. And in the pilot workshop, the facilitators actually sat down rather than standing up in front of a classroom. We arranged the tables in a circle so that everybody could see each other. There's no sense of like somebody higher had a greater power than anybody else. And the facilitators sat, and it was more of a conversation. But I think also if you approach a community about delivering or supporting their financial training that they would like to deliver in the community, really talk to them and find out as a community, what do they think is important for their community members, and how can you work with them to support their needs and increase in just sharing some of that financial knowledge that you have.
Great. Sharon, is there anything you'd like to add on that point?
Well, I'd just like to add that organizations, and I mean, AFOA Canada is developing a list of web page listing additional supports and resources specific to Indigenous people. So I encourage organizations to send me an email at financialwellness@afoa.ca. If you want to talk about it, we can. We'd like to provide resources at our webpage to where communities can go and click on that in their area, in their region, that are Indigenous specific, because this is the challenge with a lot of organizations or communities. They don't know where to go. They don't know where to look. They don't know where to find the tools. And we have a number of organizations out there, smaller ones that are regional. They do fantastic work, but they're not known outside of their region or outside their province. So if we could somehow amalgamate all of these lovely resources that talk about financial wellness and financial security and financial literacy into like a page where they can visit, that would be fantastic. They can also, we can discuss whether or not the criteria fits in with the Indigenous specific framework as well.
Yeah, miigwech everyone for sharing. I think there's another question that's pretty. I think it's a big question. It's an important question, and let's go in the same order when I ask it. And the question reads: what specific cultural influences affect how Indigenous people view and manage money that I should be aware of, so my financial counseling is relevant, respectful, and appropriate? So let's start with Simon on this question.
Well, I think I talked a little bit about that, and through storytelling. I think Indigenous people may have different stories than Canadians that could reach them in terms of learning about financial wellness or financial literacy. I think the other thing is, Helen touched on it, was when you were a lot of Indigenous people think inductively. They go from the bigger picture, and that's what Helen was talking about with her 60 scoop work. What's the big picture? What do I really want to achieve with my life? And then you go down to the narrow, where Canadians tend to do the deductive approach, which is you have to learn this skill, you have to learn that skill, and This is the knowledge that you need. So I think when you're working with Indigenous people, think about the cultural appropriateness of your approach, and also think about the messaging in terms of what is the direction that the people you are working with are taking. Do they want a better life for their families, and they're there to learn those new skills?
Miigwech, Simon. Helen?
So there's two things I just wanted to bring up here. And the one is that many Indigenous people are raised with the approach of it's a communal sharing of resources. So when we look at spending, it's not just about acquiring wealth for ourselves as individuals. It's about earning resources that we can share amongst our family and amongst our community. So when you look at items such as budgeting, it's, you want to be sure that you talk about people, talk about, do you share your financial resources with your family? If you do, put it in your budget, and just acknowledge that that is something that culturally there's a lot of sharing of money amongst family members. And then lastly, I also wanted to mention, which really cultural safety is important for all Indigenous people and respect for their cultures, which goes in line with some of the communal resource sharing that I mentioned. But I wanted to talk a little bit about safety for Indigenous women. I mentioned in my presentation that there are thousands of Indigenous missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And the reality is Indigenous women are, what's that word? I can't think of the word right now, but they're very cautious about their safety. And Indigenous people as a whole are traumatized, but women are even more, because more violence occurs against Indigenous women, and most often by strangers. And so when Indigenous women are in environments, there is an awareness of safety and what can I do that's safe, what can I do that's not. So I think we just need to be aware of that and make sure that whatever you're doing for Indigenous women, that you're really showing them that you're setting up an environment in a physical location that's safe, but also that's safe for sharing and even just spiritually safe for them.
Miigwech. Sharon?
I think just mirroring and building on, again, what Simon and Helen talked about, I think it's important to approach communities with the perspective that not everything moves quickly. And we approach things with caution. We mull things over sometimes, 5, 6 times, chew it out on the 10th time, or whatever process we have to go to. And that we do it because of the barriers that were set up and the systemic system that we operate in, we don't want to give up something that would benefit we think forward. We think of generations in advance. We plan for generations in advance. The work that I do here will benefit my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. So when I'm gone, I will be their ancestor following them around, and I will have pride, and they will have pride knowing that I am their ancestor traveling their path with them. And cheering them on. We think in different ways. There's a way our languages are different, the way that we relate to each other, property values, depending on your community. Some communities don't own land. They're provided with certificate of possessions, and that land actually belongs to the band, and you acquire it for a while. People don't own houses. When my dad left the reserve, his house went back to the band, which was perfectly fine with all of us. Tornado came through, took the house after my dad passed. We always said it was my dad coming back to get his house. So there are certain values that obviously I won't own land. That's a principle that I have built on, that I will continue. My children have a different perspective, but I myself can't own land and won't own land. because it is, I came from it and I will go back to it. So there's no way that I can own land. So that principle of ownership is completely foreign and alien to me. So these are some thought processes, not necessarily for all Indigenous people, and also it's also intergenerational because each one is going to change. So again, just approach with caution and understand that you and also Indigenous people are completely different. All of us sitting here in this room right now on this panel, we're all from different perspectives. You throw an Inuit, Dene, we all come, there's something fundamentally the same about humanity, but our thought processes are different and our values differ from tribe to tribe and community to community.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I really appreciate each of your insight on this matter, and I think that is a really powerful statement. You don't own land; you merely look after it for the next generation. So that's something that's really important. Next, I'm going to move towards something that's kind of more pandemic specific. We've all been online, and a few of you had alluded to that in your talks today. So again, this is another general question, and maybe we can move in the same order as well. And the question asks, in your experience, how has the move to or increased move to more virtual teaching in Indigenous communities for Indigenous peoples impacted your work? How well has it been received, and pros and cons? So let's go to Simon.
So I'll answer the question in two parts. One is the work that I do with First Nations education administrators. We do training online, and what we've had to do is deliver it instead of in 2 days, but in portions over a number of days, and offer more breaks. And I think all of you have experienced the same thing, that you're sitting on Zoom or whatever platform all day, and it's tiring. And people are telling me that it's more tiring to do a Zoom call than to do a telephone call. So that's one thing. With the First Nations schools, they've had to adopt very quickly. So some communities went to school. There was a COVID outbreak. They would close down the school system. Kids had to go back to home learning. So throughout Canada, each First Nations has had a challenging time to keep up with the changes that are going on in the community, but also to deliver first-class education. The other problem is in communities or in households that don't have internet access, there's a real it's a real issue for those children in those types of homes to get an adequate education. So, but on the other hand, the chair of our association said First Nations resilience during COVID is strong because, and I think Helen talked about it, was when COVID came, a lot of schools went to land-based learning or land-based healing programs. I think most of them did. And so what he said was, Canadians think teach in that box, that classroom box. Indigenous people teach on the land. And so I think we have to look at the strengths in our communities to really appreciate our culture. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Helen?
So I can speak from a couple of different perspectives. I actually did some work for AFOA Canada in the delivery of the training for the Community Volunteer Income Tax Program as a facilitator. And we tried a couple of different approaches. We had a couple of, the sessions are usually normally 2 days long. And we tried one, like a traditional workshop with 2 days, back to back. And as a facilitator, I have to say it was really draining. I needed a day to recover from it. And then we tried 2 days separated. just to see what would work and how to best deliver the sessions. And it really depends on the people in it, whether they're, because sometimes people can block off a certain amount of time where other people, they can't, right? So depends on the participants. But I also wanted to talk about, so I do some work for the Anishinaabe education system, which is a self-governing education system in Ontario, and they have 23 First Nations who deliver their own education programs and services in Ontario, and there are 13 of them have schools, so they operate their own schools. And it was really challenging for them at the beginning of the pandemic because they were following provincial guidelines on physical distancing and school delivery. And then, so they closed the schools just like everybody else did, and really to protect everybody. And then in the fall of last year, they started turning towards, like Simon mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, the land-based learning. And I really saw that take off. And because the online learning for students, in my experience, doesn't work. And I know there are some students who are exceptions who really thrive in that isolated environment. But I know I have a 17-year-old, and he acquired 1 credit for high school last year. And we're still struggling with participation in school. So there's definitely issues around the online learning for students, as well as the impacts towards their mental health. But really, the embracing land-based learning has really provided some benefits to the community members and to the students. I've heard many stories about First Nations taking students out onto the land to go moose hunting and duck hunting, and they were collecting sap from the maple trees in the spring and getting students outside, moving around. That's good for everybody's health. And they were interacting with community members who had that knowledge. And I think as a whole, anytime any person gets out into the forest, that really does improve their health and well-being. And just lastly, on the online learning, I saw a plethora of sharing of Indigenous traditional activities online. Like there were beading groups set up, there were drum groups. I also saw powwow groups being set up online where people can still gather virtually. And I even was part of a cooking class. So I think these opportunities people still manage to bring each other together in a virtual environment. And it wasn't ideal, but it was something that we made do with. And there's examples where people are really able to share their knowledge in ways they never have before with way more people.
You go, Helen. Sharon?
I think building on what Helen and Simon have to say, there's been a lot. I mean, we delivered a lot of online services prior to all of this, but we pivoted some of our in-person, obviously all of our in-person sessions to virtual learning. That was challenging. I participated in one of the CAPA sessions, so I'm going to go from the perspective of the learner. The 3 days back-to-back session, which would have been so wonderful in person, because then you can relate, you can make eye contact with people, you can talk, have your own little sessions. That was really difficult in the virtual world. The Zoom fatigue that, as a learner you experienced is so. I as an adult, I find it amazing that our children were able to do this on a daily basis, 5 days a week, from 9 o'clock in the morning till 2-3 o'clock in the afternoon. But they did it. I struggled with mine as a learner. The pandemic has affected our community and online learning in so many different ways. I mean, we're dealing with isolation, death, that impacts our ability to relate to one another is changing. Our relationships are changing. Our community, as simple as a death, like a funeral in a community where you're not able to gather to put a family member to rest, that impacts the social norms in a community. with the high number of COVID rates. And of course, now you have the natural disasters that are happening in British Columbia, where a number of First Nations communities are being evacuated. This is going to affect them long term. Online learning is already, how much more they will have to continue some sort of online capacity beyond the norms of going back into your community. You'll have to rebuild. There's so many different things that are going to impact our Indigenous communities that we have to be aware of. What else was I going to say? Isolation, limited or no access to services or opportunity. Benefits are, and this is for me, benefits from online learning is I got to learn TikTok, which is a social media share. And I got to connect with different peoples across the world. I got to learn about different cultures, different languages. I'm involved in an Indigenous community. I learn about the Navajo. I learn about the Hopi. I learn about the people of Central America. And through these sessions, individuals are teaching their traditional values and what is important, along with the powwow that Helen talked about. There was one on Facebook where our people all got together. They had a powwow. They were awarded money based on what they presented. So while online learning and is challenging, there are also benefits. And I, as a individual who loves TikToks, saw nothing but good things come out of the social media stuff. The online learning stuff is a little bit more challenging. So as a provider, I understand what Helen is talking about with our tax clinic training sessions. I'm speaking to the converted again. We all know about taxes, and we know how challenging it is to make that interesting. But we do our best. And of course, it's from an Indigenous perspective. So we try to pepper as many stories and experiences in there from an Indigenous perspective that differs from probably attending somebody else's or another tax clinic training session. So we take into here at AFOCAN, we take into consideration others' experience and include that in what we deliver, which is fantastic. I mean, I got to role play as a chief from a First Nations community in one of my sessions. So I wouldn't be able to do that if I was in person. I don't think I'd be that brave.
That's great. And, I just want to say that unfortunately we're out of time, but I'd also like in that same vein to say, thank you all for taking the time to speak with all of us today. It's been super insightful. It's been great to hear about your experiences and the work that you do. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for joining us here today. Looked like we had a great turnout, and I'm sure they are taking a lot away from this session today. So thank you to everyone. And I'd like to close the session today with an away exercise. And the away exercise is, what is one thing that you heard today that you want to learn more about after this session? And you can feel free to write this down in the chat or keep it on a piece of paper with you, and really think about that moving forward. You can find the bios of our panelists on our website here today, and they can be found across the internet. They do some great work, so it shouldn't be hard to find their names. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us here of the second day of our 2021 Able Fall virtual series. We look forward to having you attend our third day on November 23rd. We have some really great sessions planned for you that day, and we hope you will all join us then. So if you have any questions or comments about today's event, feel free to share them in the chat. But other than that, I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Tongji miigwech, Shayang Guamzin. Everyone take care. Miigwech, thank you, and take care. Bye-bye.